In the Old West, the truth isn't always what it seems. Every story here is born of dust, loss, and revenge. And voices of the Old West. And this is another scar etched in the earth.
The cold wind bit through the cracked windows of Lost Hollow as the sun barely rose above the horizon. Dust swirled in the streets, catching the faint light of morning like particles in a forgotten dream. The town, once full of life, now lay silent, its streets lifeless as if waiting for something to change. Thomas, an orphan of just 11, wandered the empty streets, his worn boots barely making a sound against the cracked earth. His parents had been taken from him years ago during a brutal raid by a gang of outlaws, men who thought nothing of burning homes and taking lives. Since then, Thomas had learned to survive alone, scavenging the outskirts of Lost Hollow for scraps, never quite belonging to anything or anyone. On this particular morning, a sense of unease lingered in the air as Thomas made his way down a dusty path leading into the dry, desolate wilderness surrounding the town. He had always stayed close to the town before, but today something drew him farther out, toward the distant hills. He needed a break from the oppressive silence of the town, from the weight of his memories, even if just for a little while. As Thomas walked, the dry grasses crunched beneath his feet, and the only sound was the wind carrying a bitter chill. It was then that he saw him, a figure slumped at the base of a scrubby tree, motionless. A man cloaked in dirt and blood, barely clinging to life. The man was Native American, but the details were hard to make out. The dirt, the blood, and the ragged state of his clothes obscured much of his features. Thomas stopped in his tracks, heart hammering in his chest. His first instinct was to turn back, to leave the man to whatever fate awaited him, but something stopped him. The man's eyes fluttered open. They were tired, sunken, and filled with a quiet desperation. His lips parted slightly as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. His body shuddered with every breath, and Thomas could see the telltale signs of a wound, a deep, grievous injury that seemed to bleed more than any body should. Without thinking, Thomas knelt beside the man, fumbling with the ragged blanket he kept tucked around his shoulders. He hesitated for a moment, but then draped the blanket over the stranger, trying to give him some warmth in his final moments. The man's eyes met his once again, locking with Thomas's in a silent understanding. The world seemed to narrow, focusing on that single moment, the weight of the stranger's life pressing down on Thomas's chest. Then, with a final, shaky breath, the man whispered something, words lost in the wind, inaudible and foreign before he died, his body relaxing into stillness. Thomas sat frozen for a long moment, his mind reeling. He had no idea who this man was, nor why he had been left to die alone in the wilderness, but something about this moment felt important. It felt like the world had shifted, that the line between the living and the dead had blurred for just a brief instant. He couldn't explain why he'd helped the man. Perhaps it was just a moment of compassion, something buried deep inside him, a fleeting attempt to do something good in a world that often felt indifferent to suffering. It was then that Thomas noticed something that hadn't caught his attention before. The man's arm, exposed where the blanket had shifted, bore a strange symbol, a tattoo. A bird, inked with painstaking precision, was etched into the man's skin. It looked almost like a map, its intricate lines forming a pattern Thomas couldn't understand, but somehow it felt significant. The town of Lost Hollow was far from peaceful, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the discovery of this symbol was no coincidence. Whatever it was more than just a mark. It was something much bigger, something dangerous. He didn't know it then, but that small act of kindness, giving a dying man his blanket, would set in motion a chain of events that would forever change his life. Thomas stood over the body of the dead man, his mind racing. The weight of the discovery, the tattoo on the man's arm, gnawed at him. He couldn't ignore the feeling that this was more than a chance encounter. The strange symbol had to mean something, but what? He had been taught to stay away from trouble, to keep his head low and avoid the dangerous men who roamed through Lost Hollow. But this wasn't just trouble. This was something far worse, something that could destroy the fragile peace that existed in the town. With a final glance at the lifeless figure before him, Thomas turned to leave, his steps hesitant, unsure of what to do next. The air around him felt thick, heavy with the weight of the unknown. The wind carried whispers, distant voices that seemed to call his name, urging him to go deeper into the mystery. As Thomas walked back toward the town, the small, worn blanket still clutched in his hands, he noticed movement in the distance. He froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. A figure approached from the shadows, tall and imposing. It was Sheriff Corbin Drake. Drake was a man with a reputation that stretched far beyond Lost Hollow, a man who held the town in an iron grip. No one dared to cross him, Not the farmers, not the merchants, and certainly not the outlaws who passed through on occasion. He was ruthless and everyone knew it. But what caught Thomas off guard was how quickly Drake's demeanor changed when he saw the dead body of the Native American. Drake's eyes flashed with something, fear perhaps, and his gaze shifted to the tattoo on the man's arm. His face hardened, and for a moment it seemed like the sheriff might say something, but instead he just nodded, his lips tight with a strange mixture of disdain and caution. "What's this?" Drake's voice was low, almost too calm. Thomas didn't know how to respond. Should he lie or tell the truth? I found him out there," Thomas stammered, his voice trembling slightly. "He was dying." Drake stepped closer, his boots crunching in the dust. He eyed the blanket in Thomas's hands, then looked back at the body. "You're sure you didn't do this?" he asked, his voice colder now, tinged with suspicion. Thomas shook his head quickly. "No, sir, I swear." Drake's gaze never wavered. "You'd be wise to stay out of this," he warned, his tone almost threatening. "People like him, men like that, don't get to die on their own terms. Not here, not in my town." Before Thomas could respond, Drake's eyes darted to the tattoo once more. He seemed to study it, as though something in it made his skin crawl. He stepped back, his hand subtly resting on the revolver at his side, though he didn't draw it. "I'll take care of this," Drake muttered, his voice low but filled with an edge. "And you?" He paused, his eyes narrowing. "You do well to keep your mouth shut. Nothing good comes from getting involved with people like him." Thomas felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he watched the sheriff turn and leave. The way Drake had looked at the tattoo, there was more to it than the sheriff was letting on. The boy didn't know it yet, but the moment he had offered the dying man his blanket, he had unknowingly become a part of something far more dangerous than he could imagine. The sheriff's warning wasn't just a threat, it was a reality, and one that Thomas would soon be forced to face head-on. As the sheriff's footsteps faded into the distance, Thomas stood frozen, the blanket still in his hands. The tattoo burned into his memory. What had the man whispered before he died? What had Drake seen that made him so nervous? And most importantly, what was the significance of the tattoo? All of it pointed to something bigger, something buried beneath the dust and blood of Lost Hollow, something that would soon pull Thomas, and perhaps the entire town, into a conflict that no one was prepared for. The days after the encounter with Sheriff Drake felt heavier than any before. The quiet that had settled over Lost Hollow seemed even more suffocating, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Thomas couldn't shake the image of the tattoo, the strange bird-like symbol etched into the man's skin. It felt like a secret waiting to be uncovered, but every time he tried to piece together the puzzle, the pieces slipped further from his grasp. He couldn't stop thinking about Drake's warning. The sheriff's eyes had been filled with something more than anger or suspicion. There was fear, and that was what unsettled Thomas the most. Fear was a powerful thing in this world, and when men like Drake feared something, it meant there was something to fear. The tattoo, the man's final words, and now Drake's strange behavior. Everything pointed to a bigger story, one that involved more than just a dying man in the desert. Thomas knew he needed answers, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't ask anyone in Lost Hollow. They were either too afraid or too corrupted to help. There was only one place left to go, the saloon. The saloon was the heart of the town, a place where information flowed freely, whether truth or lies didn't matter. Thomas knew the risks, but he had to try. If he could just find someone who knew about the tattoo, maybe he could make sense of it. Maybe, just maybe, he could make sense of the danger that was closing in on him. As he approached the saloon, Thomas could hear the raucous laughter and the clinking of glasses from within. It was the usual scene, drifters, gamblers, and outlaws hiding their secrets behind a haze of smoke and liquor. The man behind the bar, Red, gave Thomas a nod as he entered. Thomas didn't look his age. He had the hardened look of someone who had seen too much. He walked toward a corner booth, his eyes scanning the room for someone who might know something about the strange tattoo. It didn't take long for Thomas's eyes to land on the man he was looking for, an old-timer named Hank, who'd been in town longer than anyone cared to remember. Hank was a former prospector who had seen the rise and fall of Lost Hollow, and if anyone knew the town's secrets, it was him. But approaching Hank wasn't easy. The old man had a temper, especially when it came to outsiders asking questions. Thomas gathered his courage and walked up to the table where Hank sat, nursing a glass of whiskey. The old man looked up, squinting as if trying to make out the boy in the dim light. "Well, look what we got here," Hank grumbled. "Another kid wanting to play grown-up. What do you want, boy?" Thomas swallowed hard. I need to know about something. A symbol, a tattoo, a bird." Hank's hand froze mid-sip. His eyes flickered with something, recognition, maybe fear, but then he quickly masked it, leaning back in his chair. "Don't know what you're talking about," Hank muttered, his voice rough. He tried to look away, but Thomas could see the unease in his eyes. "I saw it on a man, he died," Thomas pressed, his voice quieter now, but desperate. "The sheriff, he knows what it means, doesn't he?" Hank's face went pale, and for a moment, the old man said nothing. Then in a low voice, barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Boy, you don't know what you're getting into. That symbol's old, older than you or me. It's part of something dangerous. A treasure, they say. But not just any treasure. It's got blood on it, boy. It's tied to things that people in this town have buried deep. Things they'd rather forget." Thomas's heart raced. He leaned in, needing more. "A treasure? What kind of treasure?" Hank shook his head, his eyes darting around the room nervously. "You don't want to know. You never should have gotten involved. You—" Before Hank could finish, the door to the saloon crashed open with a bang, cutting him off. Several men dressed in worn but deadly-looking clothes stormed into the room. They were part of Jack Callahan's gang, and they had a reputation for leaving bodies behind them wherever they went. Callahan himself was among them, his hard eyes scanning the room with an unsettling calm. The room went silent as the outlaws took up positions, and Callahan's gaze landed on Thomas. The air grew thick with tension, every person in the saloon holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. "Look at this," Callahan drawled, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "A little boy who thinks he's got questions. What's your name, kid?" Thomas didn't answer right away, his throat dry as he stared at the infamous outlaw, but there was no turning back now. He was already tangled up in this mess. "Thomas," he said finally, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "What do you want?" Callahan smiled darkly, his eyes flicking over to Hank, who now looked terrified. "I think you know what I want, kid," Callahan said, his voice low. "I'm looking for something. A symbol. A tattoo. And you're going to tell me what you know about it." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. Callahan knew. And if he knew, then everyone was in danger. The saloon was thick with tension, the air heavy as the men of Callahan's gang surrounded Thomas, their eyes full of menace. The room seemed to close in on him, the sound of his heart pounding louder than the murmurs of the other patrons who had wisely backed away. Hank, who had been trying to avoid trouble, now sat frozen, his hands trembling around his glass. Callahan's eyes were cold and calculating. He didn't need to ask again. Thomas could see it in his gaze. The outlaw leader had heard about the tattoo and the treasure it pointed to. There was no escaping the trap now. "You're going to tell me what you know, boy," Callahan said slowly, his voice a velvet whisper that sent chills down Thomas's spine. "You got close to something you shouldn't have. A dead man's map, and you think you can keep it to yourself? Think again." Thomas swallowed, his throat dry. His thoughts raced, but nothing coherent came to mind. He wasn't a liar, but he couldn't bring himself to tell the full truth. It wasn't just about the treasure, it was about the dangerous men who wanted it, and Thomas had no idea what they'd do to get it. I don't know much," Thomas stammered. "Just that he had a tattoo like a bird or something. I saw it before he died." Callahan's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, the weight of his boots thundering in the silence. His hand rested on the hilt of his revolver, and he wasn't smiling anymore. "That's not good enough," Callahan growled. "You're hiding something, and I can smell it on you. Where's the rest of it? The map? The treasure?" Before Thomas could respond, Hank, his face pale, leaned forward, his voice cracking. "Jack, the kid don't know nothing. He's just a boy. If there's anyone who knows, it's the sheriff. Drake's been looking for that treasure for years." Callahan's gaze snapped to Hank, his eyes burning with fury. "Drake," he spat as if the name tasted bitter on his tongue. "That damn sheriff's been lying to everyone, hoarding what doesn't belong to him. If he's involved, then this is going to get messy." Thomas's mind raced. The sheriff? Drake had already threatened him once. What if he was also searching for the treasure? What if he wanted it for himself, just like Callahan and every other outlaw? Callahan's men moved in closer, their hands hovering over their guns. The room felt smaller now, suffocating, as Thomas realized just how much danger he was in. This wasn't just about a simple treasure. It was a war over power, and he was stuck right in the middle of it. "I'll tell you what," Callahan said after a long pause, his voice low and dangerous. "You're going to help me find it, and if you don't, well, that's your choice, kid, but I wouldn't recommend it." He paused, looking over his gang, who were now circling like vultures. Thomas could feel the heat of their stares, each one more suffocating than the last. "Do you want to live, boy?" Callahan asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Then you start talking." The words echoed in Thomas's head. "Do you want to live?" The question wasn't just about survival. It was about what kind of person he wanted to be. Did he want to stand against these men, knowing the cost? Or did he want to keep his head down and let the world pass him by? I don't know where it is," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. The man was dying. He didn't have time to explain. I just found a tattoo. I'm not hiding anything, I swear. Callahan didn't move for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, you're not going to be of any use to me here, but I'll give you a little time. If I don't hear what I need soon, I'll be back. And next time I won't be so nice. With that, Callahan turned, his gang following behind him, leaving the saloon in silence. The tension in the room was thick, the weight of their threat lingering like smoke in the air. Hank was the first to speak. "You're in deeper than you know, boy," he said, his voice trembling. "You can't just walk away from this. Callahan's not someone you can cross, and neither is Drake." Thomas's mind spun. The sheriff, Callahan's gang, and the tattoo, it was all connected. He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't just stand by and watch everything fall apart. As the saloon slowly returned to its usual quiet murmur, Thomas stood alone in the corner, the heavy weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had a choice to make. Would he run, or would he fight? The night after the encounter in the saloon, Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his small shack. The weight of everything that had happened felt like a storm building in the distance, threatening to swallow him whole. Callahan's men had left, but their threat hung over him like a dark cloud, one that would follow him for as long as he stayed in Lost Hollow. The tattoo, the treasure, Sheriff Drake's involvement. It all twisted together in a way Thomas couldn't yet understand, but the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that he was at the center of something much bigger than himself. If Callahan and his gang were after the treasure, then Drake was too. And that meant nothing in this town was as it seemed. No one was innocent. Everyone had something to gain from what the dead man had left behind. The next morning, as the sun rose and painted the dusty streets in orange light, Thomas decided to go to the one place where he might find answers, the sheriff's office. He had no choice. He needed to understand what was really at stake, and there was only one man in town who could shed light on the mystery of the tattoo and its significance. Even if he didn't want to know the truth, it was too late to turn back. The sheriff's office sat at the end of the street, a worn-down building that had seen too many years of neglect. The windows were covered in grime, and the door creaked on its hinges when Thomas pushed it open. Inside, the place was quiet. Too quiet. The dusty smell of old paper and ink filled the air, and behind the desk sat Sheriff Corbin Drake, his legs propped up on the edge, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand. When he saw Thomas enter, his face darkened, but he didn't seem surprised. "What are you doing here, boy?" Drake's voice was gruff, but there was something else underneath it, an edge, like he was waiting for Thomas to say something he didn't want to hear. I came to talk," Thomas said, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. He had no plan, no strategy. He was just trying to make sense of it all. "About the man who died, the one with the tattoo. I don't know what it means, but I think you do." Drake's expression froze for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he studied Thomas. For a brief moment, Thomas could see something flicker in the sheriff's eyes. Fear, maybe, but it was gone almost immediately, replaced by cold indifference. "You've been asking too many questions," Drake said, setting the whiskey bottle down with a heavy thud. He stood up slowly, his boots echoing in the silence. "I told you before, boy. You need to stay out of this. It's not your fight." Thomas didn't move. "It is my fight," he said, surprising himself with the words. "The man died with a message. I don't know what it means, but I have to find out. If you know something, you need to tell me." Drake took a long breath and let it out slowly, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually say something that would finally make sense of the chaos. But then, just as quickly, the sheriff's expression hardened like a mask sliding into place. "You want answers?" Drake said, his voice low. "The answers won't help you. Trust me, it's better you stay out of it. That tattoo you saw, it's not just some trinket. It's tied to something that goes back a long way. And it's dangerous. For you, for everyone." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. "What is it? What's the treasure? Why are Callahan and you after it?" Drake looked at Thomas like he was a fool, a mere child who couldn't possibly understand. "You don't get it, do you? That treasure's not just gold or silver. It's power. And power's dangerous, especially in the wrong hands. Callahan wants it, I want it, but it's not something anyone can control. No one walks away from this without blood on their hands." The sheriff's words hit like a slap. Thomas felt his knees weaken. The reality of what was happening was clearer now. This wasn't just a fight over money. It was a battle for something far more dangerous. The treasure had the power to destroy lives, to tear apart whatever fragile order remained in the region. And now, it seemed, Thomas was caught in the middle of it all. "I don't want any part of this," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. but even as he spoke, he knew it was too late to turn back. The treasure wasn't just some distant thing. It was a part of him now, whether he liked it or not. The dead man, the tattoo, Callahan, Drake, it all tied together, and there was no escaping it. Drake studied him for a moment, and then something in his eyes softened just for a second. "You'll learn the hard way, kid," he said quietly. "There's no running from this, not now." The sheriff turned away, grabbing his coat off the back of the chair. "You want to survive? Then stay out of the way. Otherwise, you'll end up just like the others, dead in the dirt, forgotten." As Thomas left the office, his heart was heavy with the weight of what he had learned. The sheriff, Callahan, the treasure. It was all a game of power, and everyone had their part to play. But Thomas wasn't ready to be a pawn. He had a choice to make, a choice between running, hiding, or standing up and fighting. Thomas spent the rest of the day walking the outskirts of Lost Hollow, the weight of the sheriff's words pressing on him with every step. He couldn't ignore what he had learned. Drake was hiding something far darker than just a treasure. It wasn't just about gold or riches. It was about control, power, and a legacy buried deep in the land, tied to something much older than the town itself. But there was more. Drake had said that no one could control the treasure. He didn't elaborate, but the way his voice had cracked, just for a moment, had given Thomas pause. There was fear in the sheriff's eyes, real fear. It was something Thomas didn't fully understand, but it gnawed at him, a constant reminder that this fight was bigger than anything he could imagine. As dusk fell, a chill set in, and Thomas made his way back to his shack. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had learned. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that the sheriff was just as desperate as Callahan, or the way both men seemed willing to sacrifice everything to claim what was buried beneath their feet. The treasure was dangerous, yes, but what made it so powerful? And why did they both want it so badly? That night, as he sat by the flickering light of a small candle, there was a knock at his door. It was soft, hesitant, almost as if whoever was on the other side didn't want to be heard. Thomas hesitated before opening it, unsure who it could be. The last thing he wanted was another confrontation with someone like Callahan or Drake. But when he pulled the door open, he found himself face to face with Sarah, the sheriff's daughter. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear, but there was something else in them, determination. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Thomas felt a strange mixture of surprise and confusion. What was Sarah doing here? She should have been at home, away from all of this chaos. "Thomas," she whispered urgently, glancing over her shoulder. "I need your help." His heart skipped. "What? Help with what?" She looked around nervously before stepping inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "I can't stay with him anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "My father, he's not who you think he is. I've seen things he's done, terrible things. And now, he's involved with Callahan. They're after the treasure, and I don't think my father knows what he's getting into." Thomas didn't know how to respond. The sheriff, the man who had raised Sarah, was involved in this mess too. He couldn't imagine the kind of turmoil Sarah must have been feeling. She was only 9, and already her world had been torn apart by lies and secrets. "I don't know what to do," she continued, her eyes brimming with tears. "I overheard them talking. My father's been keeping something hidden, a map, something that points to the treasure. But Callahan, he's been threatening him. I don't think my father can handle this much longer. He's already changed. I've seen him look at me like he wants to silence me." Thomas's mind spun. If Sarah was telling the truth, it meant that everything he had feared was true. The sheriff, Callahan, the treasure. It was all connected in ways he hadn't even begun to understand. "You have to help me, Thomas," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper now, but full of urgency. "I don't know who else I can trust." Thomas stared at her, uncertainty flooding his chest. He had no idea what to do, no clear way out of this mess. He had barely kept himself alive up until now. How could he protect her too? But as he looked into Sarah's wide, terrified eyes, something shifted inside him. He couldn't ignore this. If the sheriff had changed, if the treasure was truly dangerous, then it was more than just his own survival at stake now. Sarah needed him, and for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt the weight of something deeper than just the will to survive. He felt responsibility. "I'll help you," he said, his voice steady. "But we need to get away from here. They're looking for you." Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. "I have a place, farther out in the hills. It's safe there for now." Thomas grabbed his jacket and turned toward the door, but before he could reach it, the unmistakable sound of hooves echoed through the night. It was distant at first, but then louder, closer. Someone was coming. Sarah's face went white. "They're here." Thomas rushed to the window, peering through the cracked shutters. In the distance, he saw the silhouettes of riders moving swiftly, their horses kicking up dust in the twilight. They were headed straight for his shack. He turned to Sarah, fear creeping into his veins. "We don't have much time, come on." Together they dashed out the back into the dark, the air thick with the scent of dust and the weight of what lay ahead. As they ran through the tall grass, the riders drew closer, their shadows stretching like giants over the land. Sarah's grip on Thomas's hand tightened as they slipped deeper into the night, away from the town, away from the men who wanted them both dead. But Thomas knew one thing for sure: the chase was just beginning. The night air was cold against their skin as Thomas and Sarah sprinted through the underbrush, the sound of galloping hooves growing louder with each passing second. Thomas could hear Sarah's breath quicken beside him, her small hand gripping his tightly as they ran deeper into the hills outside Lost Hollow. The shadows of the trees seemed to close in around them, offering little comfort, only a fleeting moment of refuge. The riders were close now, too close. The dust they kicked up in their pursuit hung in the air like a fog, a constant reminder of how little time they had. Sarah had said there was a safe place, but how far could it really be? And would they make it there before Callahan's men caught up to them? "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with guilt. "I didn't want to drag you into this. I thought I could handle it." Thomas glanced at her, his heart heavy. "You didn't drag me into anything. We're in this together." They didn't have time for more words. The sound of horses grew closer, and Thomas could feel the tension in his chest, his limbs burning with each desperate step. His mind raced as he tried to figure out their next move. The hills were a good start, dense and difficult for a large group to track through, but it wouldn't take long for the riders to catch up. "Keep going," Thomas urged, his voice firm. "Don't stop until we reach the cave." The cave. Sarah had mentioned it once when they first met. A secret hideout her family had used when they wanted to escape the town, but it was hidden deep in the hills, far from the road. If they could make it there, they might have a chance to hide, at least for a while. They pushed forward, their feet stumbling over rocks and uneven ground, their breath ragged in the crisp air. Thomas's mind was a blur of thoughts about Callahan, about the sheriff, about the treasure. Everything had spiraled out of control so quickly, but right now the only thing that mattered was getting Sarah to safety. As they crested a small hill, the sound of the riders grew impossibly close. Thomas turned just in time to see the flicker of lantern light through the trees. He motioned to Sarah to follow him into a small ravine, a natural trench in the land that would hopefully hide them from view. They crouched low, their backs pressed against the cool stone as they listened. The riders passed by, the sound of hooves thundering past them, so close that Thomas could feel the vibrations in the ground. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't be spotted. The seconds felt like hours. Thomas didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. He could hear their voices now, the riders shouting orders to one another as they searched the area, their lanterns casting eerie shadows on the rocks around them. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the riders' voices began to fade into the distance. The sound of the horses grew quieter, and the light from their lanterns disappeared behind the trees. Thomas exhaled a shaky breath, his heart still pounding in his chest. He turned to Sarah, whose face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't stop here," he whispered. "We have to keep moving." They didn't wait long before they began moving again, keeping as low to the ground as possible. The sound of the riders had almost disappeared, but the threat was still there, lingering in the air. They could still be following, could still be closing in on them. After what felt like an hour of carefully maneuvering through the hills, Thomas and Sarah finally reached the cave. The entrance was hidden behind a dense thicket of bushes, almost impossible to see unless you knew exactly where to look. Sarah pushed through the brush, revealing the small opening, and they slipped inside. The cave was cold and damp, but it offered them shelter for the moment. They huddled together, the darkness surrounding them like a cloak, and for the first time in what felt like days, Thomas allowed himself to breathe. He sat down on the rough stone floor, rubbing his hands together to warm them. Sarah sat beside him, her eyes still wide with fear, but a small hint of relief beginning to settle in. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm his racing thoughts. "We wait. We stay here until we know it's safe. Then we figure out what to do next." The weight of their situation pressed down on him again, but there was no turning back now. He had made a promise to protect Sarah, and he intended to keep it. Outside the cave, the sounds of the night were muted, but the silence inside felt deafening. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the sense of something dangerous, waiting just beyond the reach of the darkness. And yet, in that moment, in the quiet of the cave, Thomas knew that their fight was just beginning. The night inside the cave felt endless. The damp air was thick with unease, as Thomas sat with his back against the jagged wall, his eyes constantly flicking to the small opening that led out into the night. Sarah sat beside him, her face pale from fear but still determined. The quiet of the cave surrounded them like a suffocating weight, and the distant sounds of the wind howling outside did little to comfort them. Hours passed in silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. Thomas's mind raced with all that had happened, the sheriff's warnings, Callahan's threats, and the treasure that now felt like a curse instead of a prize. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something far worse than anything they had already encountered. Sarah broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas, what do you think is in the treasure?" He turned to look at her, meeting her wide eyes. She was just a child, barely 9 years old, but she had already seen more darkness than anyone should. Her question hung in the air, and for a moment Thomas didn't have an answer. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but whatever it is, it's tearing this town apart. Callahan wants it. Callahan, the sheriff wants it, and they'll do anything to get it." Sarah nodded slowly, her small hands wringing together. "My father, he's changed. I don't know him anymore. He's not the man he used to be." Thomas could feel the weight of her words. Sarah's father, Sheriff Corbin Drake, had always been a figure of authority in Lost Hollow. But now it was clear that the sheriff was just another man, caught up in the madness of the treasure hunt, desperate and willing to sacrifice anything, or anyone, to claim it. Thomas's thoughts were interrupted by a rustling sound outside the cave. He stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his side. Sarah's eyes widened with fear. "Do you think it's them?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Thomas stood up cautiously, motioning for Sarah to stay low. He moved toward the entrance of the cave, peering through the thick underbrush that concealed the opening. The sound grew louder, and then, suddenly there was a voice, a harsh whisper that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. "They're here." He froze. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was hunting them. Sarah's hand gripped his arm tightly. "Who?" "I don't know," Thomas said, his voice barely audible. "But we need to move. Now." He grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her deeper into the cave. The only way out was through the narrow tunnel that ran deeper into the hills. They couldn't risk staying where they were, not with whoever was outside looking for them. As they moved through the dark tunnel, Thomas's thoughts raced. He could feel the weight of every step, each one leading them farther from the safety of the town, but also deeper into a web of danger. The path was narrow and steep, the air thick with moisture. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing, the moonlight filtering through cracks in the rock. Thomas stopped for a moment, trying to catch his breath. They couldn't stop for long. They had to keep moving. "I don't think they saw us," Thomas whispered, glancing back the way they had come. "But they'll be looking. We can't go back to Lost Hollow." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Where will we go?" Thomas looked out at the hills stretching before them. He didn't have an answer. The treasure was still out there somewhere, and they couldn't escape the men who wanted it. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about stopping the madness before it consumed everything. "We head for the mountains," Thomas said, his voice firm. "There's a place there, an old cabin. We'll find shelter, figure out our next move." He pulled Sarah to her feet, and they set off again, moving quickly but quietly through the dense underbrush. The air was colder now, the night darker, and every step felt like a step further into the unknown. But as they moved deeper into the hills, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The riders, whoever they were still out there, searching, hunting, and he knew that no matter how far they ran, the danger was closing in on them fast. They couldn't outrun it forever. The night had fallen completely by the time Thomas and Sarah reached the edge of the hills. The moon was their only light, and it seemed to mock their efforts, casting long, unsettling shadows over the path they followed. The cold had crept into their bones, and every crunch of their footsteps against the dirt and rock seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet. They had been running for hours, but Sarah was beginning to tire. Her small body wasn't built for the hard trek, and she stumbled more than once, her legs trembling from the strain. "Just a little farther," Thomas encouraged, though his voice was filled with doubt. He wasn't sure how much farther they could push themselves, but he had to keep moving. If they stopped now, they would be easy targets. Sarah nodded, her lips tight, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her exhaustion was written all over her face. "We'll make it," Thomas repeated, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince more, Sarah or himself. The sounds of the night, crickets, the occasional rustle of a small animal in the brush, were the only noises that accompanied their journey. Thomas kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the flickering lantern lights of Callahan's men or hear the sound of galloping horses. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted, that at any moment someone would appear from the darkness to finish what they'd started. Then, just as his mind was beginning to play tricks on him, he heard it. A horse's hooves, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder, coming from behind. Thomas froze, his heart racing. He motioned for Sarah to stop. They crouched low behind a large boulder, peering through the darkness to see who was approaching. The sound grew louder still, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a rider, one man, alone. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the man instantly. "Jonah," Thomas whispered under his breath. The man riding the horse was Jonah, the drifter who had warned him about the dangers of getting involved in the conflict over the treasure. Jonah had been a quiet presence in Lost Hollow, a man who stayed on the edges, but the few conversations they'd had been enough for Thomas to know that Jonah was a man of his word, tough, yet with a code of honor that seemed to defy the ruthless world around him. Jonah dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby tree, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't trying to hide, but there was something cautious in the way he moved, like he was expecting something or someone to find him. Thomas stood up, making himself known to Jonah. "You're a long way from Lost Hollow," Thomas called out softly. Jonah turned, his eyes flicking to Thomas and then to Sarah, who was still crouched low behind the rock. He took a moment to size them up before answering. "I could say the same for you," Jonah replied, his voice gravelly from the dry air. "But the way I see it, you're in trouble, kid, and trouble's the last thing you need right now." Thomas stepped forward, Sarah following closely behind. "We don't have time for trouble, Jonah. We're running from Callahan's men and the sheriff." Jonah's eyes narrowed. "Drake's involved too, huh?" Thomas nodded. "They both want the treasure, it's why they're hunting us." Jonah paused for a moment, as if considering something. "The treasure's no simple gold and silver, boy. It's tied to something much darker. A lot of men have died trying to find it, and a lot more will die if it's not stopped." Thomas's stomach turned. He already knew the treasure was more than just wealth, but hearing Jonah say it so plainly made the danger feel even more real. The idea that the sheriff, Callahan, and others had killed over it, it was too much to comprehend. Jonah moved closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not here to stop you, but I'm not sure you understand what you're dealing with. There's more than just greed in this. There's blood, a lot of blood." "I don't care about the treasure," Thomas said, his voice suddenly fierce. "I just want to keep Sarah safe. That's all that matters." Jonah regarded him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then with a sigh he nodded. "Then you'll need help," Jonah said quietly. "Because you're not getting away from this alone. Callahan's a madman, and Drake, well, he's already buried too many secrets. If you're going to survive this, you're going to need more than just running." Thomas didn't hesitate. "What do we need to do?" Jonah's eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to Thomas. "We need to head for the mountains," he said, his voice hardening with determination. "There's a place I know, a safe house. But we need to move fast. Callahan's men won't give up, and Drake's too involved in this mess. They'll find us, no matter where we hide. But the mountains give us a chance, a small one. But it's better than anything else." Thomas felt a flicker of hope. He had been running, stumbling through the dark without any real plan, but now Jonah was offering them a chance, however small it might be. "Let's go," Thomas said. "We don't have much time." Jonah nodded and gestured toward his horse. "Then get on. We ride now, we ride hard." As they mounted the horse together, Thomas felt a sense of resolve settle over him. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning, but with Jonah's help maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The ride through the night was brutal. The hills were steep, the ground uneven, and the path barely visible under the cover of darkness. Thomas sat behind Jonah, trying to keep his grip firm on the horse while Sarah clung to his side, her small hands wrapped tightly around his waist. The cold wind cut through them like a knife, and Thomas could feel every muscle in his body aching from the effort of keeping his balance on the galloping horse. Jonah didn't speak much. His focus was unwavering, his eyes scanning the dark hills around them, alert for any sign of danger. His silence was heavy, and Thomas didn't dare break it. He knew they had to move quickly, but he also knew that no amount of speed could protect them from the threats that lay ahead. "Do you really think we'll make it?" Thomas finally asked, his voice low, barely audible over the sound of hooves against the rocky ground. Jonah's response was measured, his tone calm, despite the urgency of the situation. "I don't know, kid, but we have a better chance than if we stayed in Lost Hollow. Callahan's not stupid. He won't stop hunting you. He wants that treasure." "What is it about the treasure that makes it so powerful?" Thomas asked, his curiosity gnawing at him. He needed to understand, needed to know what they were running from. Jonah's eyes remained forward as he spoke, his voice distant, almost as if he were talking more to himself than to Thomas. It's not about the treasure itself, it's about what it represents. People have been killing for centuries over it. It's a key to something far older than anything we can comprehend. It's not just riches, it's control, power, knowledge, something long lost. Thomas's mind raced, trying to process what Jonah was saying. A key to what? To power. The idea made his stomach turn. This wasn't just about gold, it was something far darker. Sarah shifted slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand. Why would anyone want to hurt people for it? Jonah's expression darkened, and for the first time, he spoke with a bitterness that surprised Thomas. Because people are weak, and when they think they can control something like this, they'll do anything to take it. Your father, Callahan, they're just pawns in a much larger game, and the moment they get their hands on that treasure, it'll destroy them. The words hit hard. Thomas had never thought of his own father as a pawn in anyone's game, but Jonah's words struck a chord. There was something much bigger at play here, and if people like Sheriff Drake were willing to kill for it, what did that make him? What did that make Sarah's father? They pressed on through the night, the landscape around them growing increasingly desolate as they moved deeper into the mountains. Thomas could barely see a few feet ahead, the path barely more than a narrow, uneven trail winding through the jagged rocks. We're almost there, Jonah said after a long stretch of silence, his voice sharp with alertness. Keep quiet. They slowed the pace as they approached a small hidden clearing surrounded by thick trees. The entrance to the safe house was concealed by a large outcrop of rocks, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. Jonah dismounted first, helping Sarah down before turning to Thomas. This is it, Jonah said quietly, his eyes scanning the surroundings once more. Inside is safe for now. We'll rest here for a bit, gather our thoughts, and figure out what's next. The inside of the safe house was small but sturdy, a hidden refuge that smelled of old timber and earth. It was nothing fancy, just a few supplies and a small fire pit in the center, but it was enough for the moment. Jonah started a fire while Sarah sat on a makeshift cot, her eyes distant and tired. Thomas stood by the entrance, his mind still racing. They had made it this far, but what came next? How long would they be safe? The treasure was still out there, and Callahan's men were relentless. Even if they rested for a few hours, the danger wasn't over. Jonah seemed to read his mind. You're not safe here for long. Callahan's men won't stop searching. We've got a small window, and then we'll have to move again. But at least for now, we can breathe. Thomas nodded, though he felt a deep unease settle in his chest. It wasn't enough to escape. Not yet. There was still the question of the treasure, the mystery of the tattoo, and the growing suspicion that the sheriff was involved in something much bigger than anyone in Lost Hollow had realized. Jonah turned away from the fire and fixed his gaze on Thomas. If you're going to stand a chance, you need to understand something. This isn't about the treasure, it's about what it can do to the people who seek it. Callahan, Drake, they're already lost to it, and if you're not careful, you will be too. Thomas's blood ran cold at the words. He wasn't sure what Jonah meant, but he could feel the weight of it. Whatever was at stake, it was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined, and the clock was ticking. I won't let that happen, Thomas said, his voice firm. Jonah's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in his gaze, a quiet respect, perhaps. Good, but you're going to need all the strength you've got. The fire crackled softly in the background, the warmth of the flames offering little comfort against the coldness of their situation. As Thomas stared into the flames, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what was coming. The treasure, the sheriff, Callahan, and the lives already lost in the search for it, they were all connected now, and there was no turning back. The morning came too quickly. The mountain air was crisp, and the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground outside their refuge. Thomas woke early, his mind restless, plagued by thoughts of the treasure, the danger closing in, and the uncertain path that lay ahead. The safe house offered them a moment of respite, but Thomas knew it was only temporary. They couldn't stay here forever. Jonah had already started a small fire, its warmth a comfort against the cold morning. Sarah was still asleep, her face relaxed for the first time in what felt like days. Thomas stood quietly for a moment, watching her. She deserved peace, but peace seemed as fleeting as the sun that barely touched the mountain's peak. Jonah looked up as Thomas approached. His face was stoic, but there was a weariness in his eyes, a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. We can't stay here, Thomas said, his voice low. Jonah nodded, tossing another branch into the fire. I know. Callahan's men will be searching every inch of these hills before too long. We have to keep moving. Thomas's chest tightened. Where do we go next? Jonah took a long pause before speaking, his gaze turning distant. I've got a few places up in the high country where no one knows. There's an old mine, a place where people disappear for good, but it's not safe. It's a long ride from here." Thomas looked over at Sarah, her small form curled up on the cot. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the choice in front of him. Every path led to danger, but he couldn't keep running forever. The treasure was the key, but to what? And how much farther would they have to go before they were safe? "We can't outrun them," Thomas said, the frustration in his voice rising. "Eventually they'll catch up to us. Callahan, Drake, they'll never stop." Jonah's eyes flicked to Thomas, a sharpness in his gaze. "You're right, but we don't need to outrun them forever. We need to find a way to end this once and for all." The idea of taking the fight to Callahan and the sheriff sent a chill down Thomas's spine. He wasn't ready for that kind of battle. He was just a boy, caught in a web of violence and greed that he hadn't even begun to understand. "But how?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do we end it?" Jonah took a deep breath. "The treasure. It's not just a map or gold. It's a piece of a much larger story, one that goes back long before Lost Hollow was even a town. The people who are searching for it, they're not just looking for wealth. They're looking for control. The treasure isn't just about getting rich. It's about power, influence. Whoever controls it can control everything around them." Thomas's stomach twisted. "And Drake, Callahan, they're just pawns in that game." Jonah nodded. "That's right, and if they get their hands on it, it'll destroy them. It's already destroying them. But there's more at play here, something bigger than them and maybe even bigger than us." Thomas clenched his fists, the weight of it all pressing in. "We have to stop them." Jonah looked at him, his expression hardening. "Yes, we do, but to stop them, we have to find the treasure first. And that means going into the heart of Lost Hollow. It means facing Drake, facing Callahan, and we'll need all the help we can get." Thomas felt a surge of determination. The thought of returning to Lost Hollow was terrifying. It was the place he'd lost everything, his family, his safety, his peace. But if there was a way to stop the madness, to end this for good, he had to try. Jonah stood up, looking down at Sarah. "We can't do this alone, but there's one person who might be able to help us. Someone who knows more than anyone about the treasure. The question is, will they help us, or will they sell us out?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Jonah's eyes darkened. "Someone who's been keeping secrets for a long time. Someone who's part of the old history of this town. Someone who knows what the treasure is really worth." Thomas swallowed hard. He had no idea who Jonah was talking about, but he could feel the gravity of the moment. Whoever this person was, they were important. Maybe the only chance they had at finding the treasure before Callahan or Drake did. Jonah turned to leave, but then he paused, looking at Thomas one last time. "You ready for this?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." The ride back toward Lost Hollow was quiet. The silence between Thomas and Jonah filled only by the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves. Sarah rode behind Thomas, her face drawn, her eyes lost in thought. The world around them seemed to close in as they approached the town, the weight of everything they had learned pressing down on them. Thomas could feel the familiar tension creeping back into his chest. Lost Hollow, his home, was no longer a place of comfort. It was a battlefield, a place where his past was buried and his future uncertain. And yet, he had no choice. The treasure had to be stopped. The cycle of violence had to end. They reached the outskirts of Lost Hollow just as the sun began to set, casting a fiery orange glow over the horizon. The town lay ahead, silent and still, but Thomas knew better than to trust the quiet. There were enemies in every shadow now, Drake, Callahan, and the treasure that they would stop at nothing to find. As they rode toward the center of town, Thomas looked over at Jonah. "Where do we go from here?" Jonah didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze to the horizon, his face hardening. "We find the one person who knows the truth," he said quietly, "and we make sure that truth doesn't fall into the wrong hands." The town of Lost Hollow loomed ahead, dark and still. The once thriving frontier settlement had withered under the weight of its secrets, its dirt streets now empty, save for the occasional dust devil spinning lazily in the wind. The wooden buildings, crooked and weathered, seemed to groan under the pressure of time. A distant sound, a dog barking, a door creaking on its hinges, was all that broke the eerie silence. Thomas rode in the lead, with Jonah and Sarah close behind. His pulse quickened as they neared the heart of the town. This wasn't the place he remembered. The familiar landmarks, the saloon, the general store, had changed. There was an emptiness to it now, an oppressive weight that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Jonah led them down the main street, past the saloon where they'd had their last confrontation with Callahan's men. The memories of the threat that hung over them there came rushing back, but Thomas didn't look up. He couldn't afford to be distracted. His eyes stayed focused on the dirt road ahead. This was it, The final stretch. They couldn't afford another mistake. "Where are we headed?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice steady despite the fluttering uncertainty in his chest. Jonah didn't answer immediately. He gave a slight nod in the direction of the old church, its steeple barely visible over the rundown buildings. "That's where you'll find him, the one who knows the truth about the treasure. But be careful. He's not the kind of man who trusts easily. And after everything that's happened, who knows what side he'll take." Thomas's stomach twisted at the mention of the church. It was the last place he expected to find answers, but Jonah's face had hardened when he mentioned it, and that only fueled his growing suspicion. The church was a place of refuge for some, but it was also a place of secrets. There was no telling what kind of man had taken up residence there in the wake of the town's downfall. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the town as they approached the old church. The door stood ajar, creaking slightly in the breeze. The building seemed to pulse with a strange energy, its dilapidated exterior hiding something far more ominous within. Jonah stopped his horse just outside the door. "Wait here, let me talk to him first." Thomas nodded, but his heart was already pounding in his chest. Whoever this person was, they held the key to ending the nightmare that had taken over Lost Hollow, and now they were just a few steps away. Jonah dismounted, walking toward the church door with slow, deliberate steps. His figure disappeared inside the dark interior, and Thomas turned to Sarah, who was still quiet, her face drawn in exhaustion. "We're almost there," Thomas whispered, trying to reassure her, but the words felt hollow, even to him. How could they be almost there when everything they'd fought for seemed so uncertain? Sarah didn't respond, but her eyes shifted nervously toward the church. The tension between them was palpable, but neither of them spoke. They both knew that whatever happened next would determine their fates, and the fate of Lost Hollow itself. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Thomas shifted on his horse, unable to sit still, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Jonah had been inside for too long. What was going on in there? Why hadn't he come back? Without warning, the church door opened. Jonah stepped out, his face unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, the same steely gaze that Thomas had come to recognize over the past days. "Let's go," Jonah said, his voice low. "He'll talk, but we don't have much time." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. They were so close to the truth, but as Jonah motioned for them to follow, Thomas felt a chill creep up his spine. He didn't know who this man was or what he had said to Jonah, but he knew they were no longer just dealing with Callahan and the sheriff. They were dealing with something much deeper, something more dangerous than they could have imagined. They rode deeper into the town, the old church fading behind them as they headed toward the outskirts. The man Jonah had spoken to, whoever he was, had agreed to help, but that help came at a cost. Thomas didn't know what price they'd have to pay, but he could feel it, the weight of the promise, the burden of truth now laid upon them. As they rode further away from the church, Sarah looked over at Thomas. "What happens now?" Thomas took a deep breath. "Now we finish this." Jonah led them into the hills just outside the town, stopping at an old cabin hidden in the woods. It was a place that seemed forgotten by time, a small wooden structure with a thatched roof and overgrown vines creeping up the walls. The man Jonah had brought them to, his name was Edward, was waiting inside. Jonah knocked on the door, and a moment later, a thin man in his late 50s answered, his face shadowed by the dim light of a single candle. "You came," Edward said, his voice hoarse, his eyes scanning them carefully. "I wasn't sure you'd make it this far." Jonah nodded. "We need answers about the treasure and about the people after it." Edward's eyes flickered with recognition. "How you found it then?" he said, almost to himself. "The truth, so it's been hidden for years, buried in blood and lies." He led them inside, to a small room filled with books and old maps scattered on the floor. Edward's hands shook as he picked up one of the maps, unfurling it on the table. "It's not just about gold. Boy," he said, his voice trembling, "the treasure is a relic, something ancient. It holds the power to control. It was hidden away centuries ago for a reason, and now it's about to fall into the hands of those who will use it to destroy everything." Thomas felt his stomach churn. The weight of Edward's words pressed down on him, the full gravity of the situation now clear. They had uncovered the truth. The treasure wasn't just about wealth. It was about power, and power in the wrong hands meant disaster. "We have to stop them," Thomas said, his voice determined. "We have to stop Drake, stop Callahan." Edward looked at him with cold, knowing eyes. "It's already too late, boy. The game's already begun, and when it's over, you may wish you'd never found the truth." Jonah turned to Thomas, his expression grim. "We don't have a choice. We have to finish this." But Thomas wasn't so sure anymore. Was there even a way to stop it? Could they undo the damage already done? In the back of his mind, the answer came to him in a flash. No, there was no turning back now.
When the smoke clears and the bodies fall, only silence remains. If this story touched you, subscribe, because in the West, nothing stays buried for long.